On this channel, amongst the many things we've explored, is precisely what happens when a dictator has their power challenged but refuses to step down even in the face of mass protests, instead tightening their grip on society and driving their boot heel further upon the backs of their country's citizens. When this occurs, the despot may succeed in overcoming the challenge to their rule, but will likely only further alienate an already resistant population, thereby simply kicking the can of their eventual fall from power just a little bit further down the road. But what happens when a dictator is successfully removed from power? What, if anything, changes for the citizens, and what does it change for the fortunes of the country? Well, unfortunately, as we shall see today, the case of Sudan shows that the results of such a rupture can be just as bad as life under the dictator, as brutal as that may have already been. In fact, the Sudanese case may be considered a cautionary tale for what may happen when an unpopular yet stabilizing dictator is removed from power and a political vacuum remains in its place. So today on WarFronts, we turn our attention once again towards Sudan, focusing on all that preceded the horrific ongoing conflict and the conditions laid out by its long-term dictator, Omar Al-Bashir. In doing so, we'll look into the story of al-Bashir, who he is, what did he do, and what has become of both him and Sudan since the end of his reign in 2019. Before getting into all of that, it is important to understand that Sudan is a very complex country, even by comparison with other countries with similarly difficult recent histories. For one thing, Sudan is an absolutely immense country in its size. Before the South split off in 2011, Sudan was the largest country in Africa and one of the largest in the entire world at a gargantuan 2.5 million square kilometers. Even after South Sudan seceded, it remained the third largest country in Africa and the 16th largest country in the world, and it is also an incredibly diverse place in terms of population. It's estimated that around 600 different ethnic groups inhabit Sudan, with around 400 languages being spoken between them. Yet in some ways, Sudan's problems are commonly boiled down to simmering divisions and rival interests between two groups of people: the predominantly Muslim Arab tribes of the north and the black African populations in the west and south, a diverse mix of faiths, including Christianity and African traditional religions, as well as a large Muslim population. The relationship between these communities and the way in which they were influenced by Sudan's leadership are factors which go some way to explain the massive instability which has dogged Sudan for much of its recent history, both during the reign of al-Bashir as well as after. So now let's turn our attention to who exactly Omar al-Bashir is and why his removal from power left such a bloody void. Unlike some other modern dictators whose origins are deliberately shrouded in an element of mist, al-Bashir's humble origins in northern Sudan are not only quite well documented, but are essential in understanding his support base and the power system in the country as a whole. Born to a peasant family in northern Sudan, close to the capital of Khartoum, al-Bashir is a member of the al-Badira al-Dashmashia, a Bedouin Arab tribe belonging to the Ja'alin coalition, one of the most important tribal confederations in Sudan. He received secondary education in Khartoum and then joined the Sudanese army, going on to attend military training college in Cairo and fighting alongside the Egyptian army in the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. Al-Bashir had a successful career in the military, becoming his country's military attaché to the United Arab Emirates in 1975, before returning to Sudan and playing a leading role in the government's civil war campaign against rebels in the south in the 1980s. In 1989, he led a coup to topple the government of Sadiq al-Mahdi, the democratically elected Prime Minister of Sudan who'd been in office since 1986. In its place, al-Bashir and his allies introduced the so-called Revolutionary Command Center for National Salvation, or RCC, the transitional government which he led for 4 years before abolishing it and proclaiming himself president of Sudan under military rule. He would remain president for over a quarter of a century before he was finally toppled in 2019. Al-Bashir's rule over Sudan was punctuated by a stranglehold over the political system, the suppression of political opposition, and the introduction of a conservative Islamic political order. Only a few months after taking power, and with the backing of his tribal allies, he banned political parties and clamped down harshly upon the press. Before long, al-Bashir reintroduced Islamic Sharia law as the legal code for Sudan. The use of Sharia law in Sudan was not an al-Bashir invention. It had been first introduced in Sudan all the way back in 1983, but it had been suspended by the government of Sadiq al-Mahdi, himself an imam and Islamic scholar of the Sufi tradition, who'd labeled it a travesty of Islam. But within 2 years after al-Bashir's coup had brought al-Mahdi's government down, Sharia law was reinstalled in all but 3 regions of southern Sudan alongside a penal system closely resembling one drawn up by Hassan al-Turabi, an influential hardline scholar who'd been a close ally to al-Bashir during the coup. Moreover, al-Bashir also led Sudan into becoming known as a state sympathizer with terrorist activity. Already by 1993, the US Department of State officially listed Sudan as a sponsor of terrorism due to evidence of its support for groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and al-Qaeda. Residing in Sudan for 5 years during the 1990s was Osama bin Laden, who was only several years away from orchestrating the 9/11 attacks and who had already by this time both founded al-Qaeda and earned a reputation as a high-profile sponsor of jihadist activity across the globe. Bin Laden resided in Sudan at the invitation of al-Bashir, and this would have negative consequences for Sudan's world standing, as progressive US sanctions would soon be leveraged against Sudan with the rollout of President Bill Clinton's tough anti-terror policies in the late 1990s. This policy would continue in the 2000s as new US President George W. Bush would not only follow the tough line on terror pursued by the Clinton administration, but would incorporate an evangelical Christian element to his foreign policy priorities. As some analysts concluded, this probably had some bearing on Sudan, with some Bush advisors having framed the ongoing conflict in southern Sudan as a fight for emancipation and self-determination by an oppressed Christian community in a highly Islamized society. As such, the resulting US pressure exerted on al-Bashir likely contributed to the eventual end of the conflict and the successful secession of South Sudan in 2011. Whether this was the case or not, al-Bashir certainly did wisen up to the need to tread carefully with regards to the United States' changing objectives at the turn of the century. This was especially true in the wake of 9/11, something which, as a reminder, had been committed by a man who had spent a large part of the previous few years living and investing heavily in Sudan. Al-Bashir may have also been buoyed by the vicious US response to its war on terror, including its invasion of Iraq and the toppling of Saddam Hussein in 2003. Recognizing the changing winds, he dialed down his Islamist programs and soon signed a deal which ended the decades-long civil war with the South. Al-Bashir also fell out with and imprisoned his former ally Hassan al-Turabi, the cleric who'd been the chief ideologue behind the introduction of Islamic Sharia law at the beginning of al-Bashir's presidency. But despite this, al-Bashir's rule of Sudan did not scale down its intense suppression of personal freedoms or the depravity faced by some Sudanese. This would be especially true for inhabitants of the arid western region of Darfur. Even as the decade-long conflict in southern Sudan began to wane, a new and arguably more severe form of barbarism was taking off in Darfur under al-Bashir's watch. Darfur, or Land of the Fur People, is home to a population predominantly composed of black Africans, chiefly the Fur, Masalit, and Zaghawa ethnic groups, who had begun to seek emancipation of their own, citing underinvestment, underrepresentation in the Sudanese political system, poor economic conditions, and instability resulting from land disputes with local nomadic Arab tribes. Unlike the South Sudanese, the Darfuris were predominantly Muslim or animist and may not, therefore, have fallen under the same magnifying glass shone by the US administration on the long-time conflict occurring in southern Sudan at the time. They would soon be met with the total and unmitigated force of al-Bashir's brutality. In 2003, the Darfur conflict began when 2 rebel groups, the Sudan Liberation Movement and the Justice and Equality Movement, rose up against the Sudanese government. At the time, Sudan's military was mostly tied up either in South Sudan or protecting oil pipeline projects along the northwestern Red Sea, which were under threat from attacks by Eritrean rebel groups. The rebels thus achieved some swift successes, including a surprise attack on a government barracks in Darfur's capital, Al-Fashir, which saw government military infrastructure destroyed and a major general of the Sudanese army captured. With government forces stretched, al-Bashir responded by arming local Arab militias in Darfur and giving them carte blanche to wipe out the uprising through any means that they saw fit. These militia groups, substantially composed of members of the Baghari Arab ethnic group, were known by the umbrella term the Janjaweed, a term understood to mean the devils on horseback, and a term which would become synonymous with the runaway brutality which was to come. Over the next few years, according to Al Jazeera, at least 300,000 people were killed and a further 3 million would be displaced by the combined force of the Sudanese army and the Janjaweed amidst a carnival of violence and brutality. The conflict was punctuated by a sequence of atrocities including mass killings, widespread sexual abuse, pillaging and torching of entire villages, and streams of civilians fleeing across the border into nearby Chad. Already by late 2004, US Secretary of State Colin Powell described the events in Darfur as a genocide, but this did not result in decisive intervention by any outside actors, and the killings and displacement continued for many years thereafter, arguably never entirely stopping even to this day. At the forefront of the violence in Darfur were several close political allies of al-Bashir, one of whom was Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, better known as Hemeti, a brutal Janjaweed leader from the Rizigat tribe of the Bagara. Hemeti would be decorated by al-Bashir for his actions in Darfur, being given the title of Brigadier General by al-Bashir when the Janjaweed would become reincarnated as the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, and deployed as a sort of private security force serving the president's whims from 2013. The RSF would go on to be deployed in Yemen and Libya in the years before al-Bashir's downfall, and during that time, Hemeti was also given the freedom to plunder Darfur's abundant gold mines, becoming one of the richest and most powerful men in Sudan. In July 2008, with the Darfur War ongoing and its many atrocities beginning to come to light, al-Bashir was the subject of an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court, earning the dubious honor of becoming the first sitting head of state in history to be wanted by the ICC, although figures like Vladimir Putin and perhaps Benjamin Netanyahu would later join him. The month after the warrant was issued, Sudan announced that it would not ratify the Rome Statute, which gave the court its power, and therefore did not consider itself bound to its decisions. The warrant was, in fact, criticized by some human rights groups who feared that it would derail efforts to secure aid access to the people who needed it in Darfur, and also by multinational organizations such as the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the African Union, which claimed the ICC's prosecutors displayed a bias against African leaders and encouraged its members not to comply with the court's order to arrest him. Presumably, this allowed al-Bashir a certain measure of confidence and defiance of the court. The war in Darfur continued uninterrupted, and al-Bashir flouted the warrant for his arrest by paying state visits to various countries, including Jordan, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, amid a charm offensive intended to maintain the legitimacy of his rule in the wake of the charges being leveled against him. But the walls would eventually start caving in anyway. Domestically, al-Bashir began to face economic challenges which would imperil his rule. The secession of South Sudan in 2011 saw 3/4 of Sudan's oil reserves depart with it. And while Sudan and South Sudan worked out a deal favorable to al-Bashir to split the profits of South Sudan's oil exports, the loss in oil revenue nonetheless came as a hit to Sudan's fragile economy. Moreover, while al-Bashir had sought to relieve some of Sudan's negative attention by bringing to a close the conflict in South Sudan, the continuing conflict in Darfur resulted in a new wave of international sanctions, which would sink Sudan's economy further. Challenges would continue to mount, one on top of another, and only worsen as the 2010s progressed. The country began to face an acute shortage of hard currency, followed by rapid inflation and a sharp devaluation of the Sudanese pound. Popular discontent rose, and when the fall for Omar Al-Bashir finally came, it came hard and it came fast. In late 2018, with the Sudanese economy in the doldrums, widespread protests against Al-Bashir exploded onto the streets. Realizing the depth of the people's enmity, the army decided to pitch their lot in with the citizens. On the 11th of April 2019, the president of Sudan was overthrown by the military and imprisoned. A military government was declared, and it was further announced that al-Bashir would not be extradited to the ICC to face trial for his outstanding warrants, but would be prosecuted domestically for a range of charges, including the 1989 coup, which had brought him to power. Al-Bashir and many of his allies were imprisoned in the Koba prison in Khartoum, and a transitional government was soon established under General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, a high-ranking general in the Sudanese army. Now, while the transitional government was intended to spearhead a move toward a stable and democratic system of government, this plan didn't last long. Disagreement between al-Burhan and Hemeti, chiefly over the incorporation of the RSF into the Sudanese military apparatus, soon exploded into an open conflict. And with that, the Sudanese civil war began. Now, we won't go into the details of the ongoing war, not only because we've already done so on this channel, and we highly recommend you check out that video, but also because there is simply too much information surrounding that conflict to include in this video about Omar Al-Bashir. But in the short form, as it stands, 1 year after the beginning of the war, the territory of the state of Sudan is mostly split between three major factions. In the north and the east, the Sudanese military under General Ahmed Al-Burhan, the de facto leader of Sudan, controls most of the territory. In the south, the People's Liberation Movement, a rebel group allied with South Sudan, controls several small but economically significant pockets of land, including some of the most oil-rich portions of Sudan proper. proper, and in the west and center, including large parts of the principal cities of Khartoum and Omdurman, alongside much of the region of Darfur, sit the RSF under its commander, Hemedti. Amidst all violence and the horror carried out in the war to date, the RSF has been particularly liable for some of the most heinous acts of the conflict. The governor of West Darfur, Khamis Abakar, brought attention to the unspeakable violence which had returned to the region in a speech in June 2023. He was abducted and murdered only hours later by gunmen likely belonging to the RSF. The RSF, like other factions in the conflict, is supported by a number of foreign state and non-state actors, each with their own, primarily economic or strategic reasons to become involved. To a great extent, however, the RSF also appeals to jihadist factions across the Central African region and has attracted a large slew of foreign fighters from countries like Chad, Niger, Mauritania, and Mali. What is important to note is that the RSF, continuing the example set by Al-Bashir, offered free rein for the plundering of assets in the regions of Darfur it has captured. Looted items from Darfur have become a common sight at markets across the Sahel region to the extent that these have become known as Dagalo markets. And amidst all of this, you may ask, what's become of Al-Bashir, the fallen ruler who once had it all? In truth, it's not really known. Having been imprisoned in Khartoum since his downfall, Al-Bashir was ostensibly moved to a military hospital located in the city of Omdurman in April 2023. The hospital area quickly became the epicenter of the fighting, with reports that the hospital itself, with Al-Bashir in it, came under siege by RSF fighters not long after. With no reliable update on the fate of Al-Bashir since May 2023, it's thought possible that Al-Bashir and his allies, some of whom had been facing the death penalty for their crimes, may have escaped from a captivity amidst the lawlessness which engulfed Sudan since the outbreak of hostilities. If this is true, it is unlikely that the 80-year-old Al-Bashir will play any significant role in the future of Sudan, regardless of how the civil war turns out. Indeed, it's very possible that whoever has Al-Bashir in their custody may simply decide to use him as a bargaining tool, as he remains officially a fugitive from international justice and the clutches of the courts in The Hague. However, it might just mean that one of Africa's great dictators, the Butcher of Darfur, who was willing to unleash vicious militia units upon his own citizens for personal gain, might simply have slipped through the rungs of justice and escaped into the night alongside the forces of brutality that he helped establish. Unfortunately, the situation in Sudan does not show many signs of improvement in the near future. The ongoing war has resulted in huge casualties, mostly among civilians, and has engulfed large swaths of the country, such as the capital, Khartoum, which were previously far removed from the conflicts as they occurred in the south and in Darfur. There is now tangible risk of Sudan following the path of Libya, becoming split between warring factions and regions governed by warlords amidst lawlessness, or even balkanizing in the fashion of former Yugoslavia, with Darfur following the path of South Sudan and separating from Sudan entirely. For now, however, the conflict rages on, and with the multitude of outside actors invested in the course of the war, it may sadly only continue, or even rise in intensity. But for any who would be tempted to consider that the reign of Omar Al-Bashir was the comparative lesser of two evils when contrasted with the current situation in Sudan, it's important to remember that the violence occurring today is, in some ways, a consequence of the ruinous measures introduced by Al-Bashir during his 30-year rule. It was Al-Bashir who'd allowed the implementation of Sharia law when he assumed power, aligning himself with hardline clerics like Hassan al-Turabi and alienating moderate Muslims resistant to religious law, as well as the sizable non-Muslim minorities, which also inhabited Sudan. It was al-Bashir who'd offered to host Osama bin Laden in the 90s and drew sanctions upon Sudan, which stunted its economic development. Worst of all, it was al-Bashir who armed and unleashed the Janjaweed militia in Darfur, allowing it to ravage and plunder at will, and it was he who cultivated the bestial organization which would become the Rapid Support Forces and the enriching of its leader, Hemedti. And aside even from this, it was al-Bashir's repressive measures and poor economic decisions which alienated his own population and directly contributed to his own overthrow, with these erratic and short-sighted decisions contributing to the crisis of governance which continues to plague Sudan to this day. Also, it's not really clear if al-Bashir was the strongman that he may have thought he was. The BBC quoted Sudan analyst Alex Dawal in describing how al-Bashir's length of time in office may simply have been due to the fact that any potential political rivals, especially in his National Congress party, distrusted each other more than they did him, something which would seem to be supported by the explosive conflict between al-Burn and Hemedti in the time following his downfall. It's also not even assured that his political regime had really any chance of continuing had he not been toppled by a coup. Despite al-Bashir's attempts to coup-proof his reign through the buffeting of his government with groups like the RSF, unlike other dictators that we will cover on this channel at some point, he didn't really seem to have a clear successor of any kind. He had no children, and even his favourite subordinate, Hemeti, was not really seen as a successor, rather than as a partner and a leading bodyguard. Generally, al-Bashir did not appear to have really anything much of a blueprint for how life should be in Sudan after his reign ended, and he may, in fact, simply have been treading water by seeking to remain as president for the rest of his life, merely to avoid the inevitable prosecution that would follow his fall from power due to the unspeakable acts committed during his reign. The outstanding warrant for his arrest by the ICC was followed up in 2010 by a new warrant for the charge of genocide, the first ever such warrant in the court's history. Whatever it is that al-Bashir had planned to occur in the wake of his rule, the reality was many times worse for everyone concerned.